Hello, hello. Mwakabwanj to any Chinanja speakers out there. Mwabugawati to the Chitonga speakers. Bujadi Gamadawa to any Gadigal listeners. And finally, G'day. My name is Matthew Thomas, and I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Sydney within the Sydney School of Education and Social Work. You might be able to make out the University of Sydney in the distance. I'm out on the balcony here. As you can see, I'm working from home, living the quarantine life, as I'm sure many of you are. I hope you're staying safe and sane right now amidst these really bizarre and tumultuous times. I've never actually done one of these video presentations before, nor have I attended a virtual conference, so I hope this goes well. That said, fortunately, my Zambian colleagues and I had pre-recorded an interview for a different purpose here at the University of Sydney for a presentation that we gave. So I'll be splicing together a couple of pieces from that particular interview in today's presentation, and I'll let them introduce themselves a little bit later. But for now, I'm here in Redfern, New South Wales in Australia, and here we almost always begin formal presentations with an acknowledgement of country as an opportunity to stop and pause and to remember where we are. I think this could not be more apropos given the focus within CIES this year on education beyond the human, considerations of land and our relationship to land as well as to each other, and certainly specific to our presentation today as well, considerations of the lingering vestiges of colonialism. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to myself, again, different version of myself, who will go through an acknowledgement of country and then walk through some of the PowerPoint slides that are relevant to this particular presentation and include some of those interview excerpts from my Zambian colleagues who, again, will introduce themselves a little bit later. Thanks so much. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Before we begin today's presentation, we would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I am right now, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. It is upon their ancestral lands that the University of Sydney is built. So as we share our knowledge and research practices together today, we would like to pay our respects to elders, past, present, and emerging, and remember the knowledge embedded forever within custodianship of country. The title of our presentation today is Reconsidering the Sociological Canon in Zambian Pre-Service Teacher Education, from Marx, Mead, and Mills to Mbuyi, Mulenga, and Munkombwe. And as you'll notice, this is a co-authored presentation and paper, and I will now turn it over to my two colleagues to introduce themselves.
My name is Serenje-Chipindi. I'm affiliated with the Department of Education Administration and Policy Studies and the School of Education. My areas of research are basically in higher education identities, the political economy of higher education, how higher education intersects with the economic landscape, the political landscape, the ideological landscape of the country.
Mm-hmm. Great.
Hello. I'm Janet Serenje-Chipindi. I'm a lecturer of sociology of education in the Department of Education Psychology, Sociology and Special Education at the University of Zambia. I have a Bachelor of Education in Special Education, a Master of Education in Sociology of Education. I'm currently pursuing a PhD in Sociology of Education, focusing on early childhood education. I'm interested in teacher education. I also do research in sociology of education and, of course, early childhood education.
So Ferdinand and Janet and I have been longtime friends and colleagues. You can see us here together at the University of Zambia campus with my partner as well. And through conversations, Janet and I realized that we were teaching very similar sociology of education courses at the University of Sydney and University of Zambia, respectively. These were large mandatory courses taken by students across all programs who were generally in their second year. And we started to have conversations. We were curious, essentially, how did our courses compare? So this led us to a larger project where we were looking at sociology of education in comparative perspective, but also specifically in Zambia. So one of the first outputs of the project is a comparison of our course syllabi, looking at questions of how they were constructed, what theories are we aiming to teach to our pre-service teachers in these respective courses, how are they similar, how are they different, and then of course how are the syllabi enacted. This work has led to a book chapter that will be coming out soon in a volume called Course Syllabi in Faculties of Education Across the World, to be published in Bloomsbury. Hopefully you'll be able to read more about that particular comparison in the future if you're interested. Now we will go back to Janet, who will talk a little bit about the specific Sociology of Education course at the University of Zambia, as well as some of the things that we learned through our comparison of the contexts in which we were producing and enacting our different syllabi for sociology of education.
All right, so the course at UNZA is called Sociology of Education, and it is offered to all second-year students that are doing the teacher education program. Okay, and I've been teaching that course since 2010, and then I've coordinated it for 3 years. So in the past, we used to have a lot of students. The highest I think we had was 1,800 students. And then last year, we had 1,200 students in the course. Mm-hmm. Okay, so it is a course that is done by almost everyone that is doing the teacher education program. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think what is interesting is are the things that we focus on. When you look at sociology, you think it's taught almost the same way everywhere. But our syllabus, I think, focuses more on the theoretical part. And when I look at the sitting one, we see that students are there, maybe taught most of the professional things that they need. For example, they look at the teaching profession, like they focus on the teaching profession. Though even in our syllabus, we do focus on that, but the topics that we have there they don't show the things that we focus on. Maybe let me say that, like when you look at our syllabus, you would think we focus on certain things, and maybe we leave out a lot of things, but it's not the case, because when we're discussing in the way we go into details. For example, there's a topic called the teaching profession, and the subtopics are just characteristics of a profession and all that. But when we're discussing those things, we go beyond that. We look at the teaching profession in Zambia, the code of ethics, the different organizations in the education system, which are not reflected on the syllabus. But I think the sitting one is more specific. So when you look at the syllabus, you're able to tell exactly what is taught in that course, which is somehow hidden in the UNZA syllabus.
Right, and I think that was one of the things that we argued in the chapter as well, that the different contexts in which the syllabi are being produced largely influence the amount of detail that's included in them in terms of regulations or professional standards and those types of things. And so
with this comparative context in mind, we'll focus in today's paper on the Zambian case, and we would like to note that this is a work in progress. We therefore invite comments, questions, and connections, but also ask that you recognize that this is not a paper that has been published yet. Obviously, we hope to publish it at some point in time. We are pursuing two lines of inquiry in this particular paper. One that focuses on how generally sociology of education is taught at the University of Zambia. For example, what sociological theories are privileged, or how do pre-service teachers value these theories for their future work as teachers? And secondly, perhaps paradoxically, what might a more localized Zambian sociological imagination entail, to quote C. Wright Mills? In this paper, we are drawing theoretically on work in post-colonial, decolonial, and Southern theoretical paradigms, as well as other research and work on ecologies of knowledge production and dissemination. So, for example, Chakrabarty has written noting that some theories seem to emanate from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. And in our case, we might represent this by the work of Karl Marx, that it seems to lend its generalizability to everywhere around the world, even though it was written and produced in a very specific context. Keim has called this a distorted form of universalism, and similarly, Raewyn Connell has questioned why and how certain sociological theories seem to be elevated to a level of general theory, while others are overlooked and excluded. And of course, De Souza Santos has written similarly about the epistemological diversity that is present and yet often overlooked and ignored. In terms of the research methods, the study was conducted at the University of Zambia, which was established in 1965. As we mentioned earlier, within the School of Education, this specific course is a Sociology of Education course for pre-service teachers. In 2017, approximately 1,200 students were enrolled in the course, so it's a massive unit, large mandatory unit, as we said earlier, taken mostly by second-year students. But because it's so large, it needs to be divided into 3 different streams. And here's an image of one particular stream in a large lecture theater at the University of Zambia. This would be one lecture that would be held for one stream, and then there would be other lectures for other streams, as well as other tutorials throughout the week as well. In terms of the research methods, we utilized a mixed methods design. So after attaining ethics approval and participant consent, surveys were completed by 318 pre-service teachers at the University of Zambia enrolled in this particular Sociology of Education course, and 4 focus groups were conducted for a total of 20 students involved in those focus groups. A focus group was also conducted with tutors who were working on the course as instructors, and reflections and field note observations were kept by the coordinators and lecturers themselves. These took various forms, but sometimes represented their own personal notes or maps. As a research team, then we engaged in a lot of communication via Skype and Zoom and other platforms to try to stay in touch throughout this process and analyze the data. Fortunately, I was also able to go to Zambia several times throughout the project to engage in continuous comparison of the data as we analyzed it and looked towards specific findings. We'll present 3 of those key research findings today, the first of which emphasized tensions between theory and practice. So, for example, several pre-service teachers wanted the course to be more practical or to include practical examples. And they noted this in a final question on the survey that was completely optional. Only a third of the students actually answered the question, and many of them just talked about the material constraints of the course or of the program. So it was notable that they actually said that this one thing that they wanted to improve about the course was that it had a more practical element. Another PST suggested that there should be opportunities to practice their knowledge outside of the university. And we saw similar sentiments in the focus group data, with one student, for example, suggesting that when it is practical, the knowledge will remain fresh in our minds. So this key tension between theory and practice was experienced by the pre-service teachers in this particular Sociology of Education unit, something that is perhaps not so foreign to many of us who are teaching in teacher education programs around the world. A second key finding was students' preference for more contemporary research and theoretical perspectives in lieu of knowledge perhaps associated with a more historical sociological canon grounded in European perspectives. So they suggested that course instructors should, quote, remove ancient topics, and that due to changes on society, we need new research. For example, Maxwell, which is a pseudonym, all of the names in this presentation are pseudonyms, suggested that most of the stuff we look at are a century old, and Cholwe said, I also believe in new knowledge. Inasmuch as we have the fathers of sociology who have given us their views, hasn't there been any change from the time these people were there up to today? I feel things have changed, and so I was thinking maybe we can adapt some new knowledge. Third and finally, we found it really interesting that there was a desire for more engagement with sociological perspectives of contemporary issues, including but not limited to HIV/AIDS, poverty, and unemployment. So in a focus group, for example, Chimunya said, "There are so many issues that have arisen that affect students and everybody else. I think they, the instructors, should bring up things like HIV/AIDS in detail." And this was actually echoed by some of the tutors as well. So Mulenga, a tutor, said, "We should also include contemporary issues that will be able to help the learners and benefit the community. We have seen how pupils are abusing drugs and the society is affected. So we should include issues that are affecting us today, like poverty, unemployment, gender-based violence. All those vices should be included in sociology." Finally, then, we'll conclude by just thinking through some future directions for this particular project and beyond. We've been thinking a lot about what a sociology of education in or for Zambia might look like, and raising some open-ended critical questions for engagement and thought experiments as we continue advancing this work. First and foremost, what might a sociology of education as explored and disseminated by Mbuyi, Mulenga, and Munkombwe entail? And as per the title of our presentation, these are actually hypothetical sociologists from Zambia. These are very common Zambian surnames, but we thought it was an interesting juxtaposition with Marx, Mead, and Mills to have Mbuyi, Mulenga, and Munkombwe as these perhaps rising Zambian sociologists who we've not heard of and yet have so much to offer sociology all around the world, and yet have not yet broken into the discourse of sociology. Secondly, what are the local examples and metaphors that might help us illustrate sociological contexts and concepts in Zambia, but also beyond? So one of our colleagues at the University of Zambia is very fond of drawing on this metaphor of an anthill and using that metaphor to represent a variety of different concepts. We've seen similar approaches within the Pacific. So Pacific scholars drawing on metaphors of water and of the ocean and of different ways of being and thinking. What are these different examples and metaphors that can be utilized to illustrate sociological concepts that spawn new ways of thinking? Third and finally, then, what might the Zambian version of Dan Lordy's School Teacher look like? We would encourage anyone who hasn't read this text. It's a 1975 book, really interesting sociological analysis of schooling in the United States. What would that look like if it were written by a contemporary Zambian sociologist, and would we be reading it? How would it be different? How would it be similar? So trying to push the envelope a little bit with some of these ideas and encourage different forms of scholarship to emerge. Second, and more broadly, how can we continue to decolonialize and de-imperialize? And certainly myself, as a white scholar born in the United States and based at the University of Sydney, I'm implicated in all of these processes and constantly reflecting on my role in engaging in this type of work. But more broadly, outside of my own specific research profile, I think considerations of how we can all actively engage in processes in terms of conducting syllabi audits, in terms of privileging knowledge forms and resources and readings from different perspectives as a way to continue to move us down that pathway. Third and finally then, and particularly important in teacher education, we would argue that pre-service teachers are being prepared and inculcated into sociological patterns of thought, whether they're aware of this or not. And of course, this goes back to the common notion of the hidden curriculum. For our pre-service teachers, they often come to teacher education assuming that they know what school is like because they've been through it as a student for 12 or more years. But perhaps there are other ways of thinking about it, and I think it's incumbent upon all of us to really carefully analyze and critique what we're reproducing within teacher education coursework, and in this case, specifically within sociology of education, recognizing that the perspectives, the ideas, the theories that we privilege are those that our pre-service teachers will take with them as they go forward in their work as future teachers. So stay tuned. We're really excited about this particular project. As we mentioned, there's already been a paper that is written as a chapter in this book that should come out soon. I'd also like to turn it over to Ferdinand, and he can say a little bit more about one of his publications that's come out recently.
If people want to search for it and read more about the university context in Zambia, what's the name of the article and where can they find it?
Yeah, so the article is The Ontology of Nation, Academic Identity Among Early Career Faculty at the University of Zambia. It can be found on, I think it's the Forum for International Research in Education.
Thanks, Ferdinand. And here is the publication on the slide, as well as the reference to the chapter in the Bloomsbury book that we mentioned earlier. And here are some of the pieces we referenced in the paper. There are tons more in this general theoretical space that we would encourage you to read and engage with. Finally, here's our contact information. We're all available on Twitter or via email. We would love to hear from you if you have any comments, questions, or connections, or want to engage any further with this particular project or any of our other bodies of work. We would love to hear from you. Thank you so much for making it all the way through the presentation. We wish you the very best virtual CIES you could possibly have, and we hope to hear from you soon. Stay safe, stay sane. Cheers.